Generally, when you begin a lesson such as this and visiting in another place and preaching, you thank the elders and the congregation for inviting you to come and be with them. But tonight I have the added appreciation for the fact that I was supposed to have preached on Wednesday evening, and my two daughters and I took a trip to Wisconsin, but we visited my brother who lives in Illinois, but the motel was in Wisconsin this past week, and they had planned the trip for this week, and I'd agreed to preach this week on the 7th, and we were going to be gone. And I asked to call Donnie and ask him about that, and he said, "Oh, sure, we'll take care of that." And so we did, and we got it switched from Wednesday to Friday, and I appreciate that because otherwise we've had to change our trip, and we had a non-refundable motel room, so it might have been somewhat of a problem. You know, we think about how you obtain lessons, and Jacob asked me tonight about the lesson, about what have anything good for them. I said, well, my daughter sent me a text message of something that she had read and said, I think there's a sermon in there somewhere. And so I took it, and I believe it did a pretty good job. We have a few people here tonight from Berea, and they have to listen to the same lesson again, and I appreciate them being here as well. One of them, my grandson, and appreciate him being here. He's the IT man that usually takes care of all of these things in the computer end of this situation. We're going to talk about tonight the idea of focused. That's not what we had. I don't know what we did there, but we did something. Let's take that one off. If we don't have it, that's all right. I can do it without it. I gave it to him. We had it on there, I thought. But we're going to preach a lesson that talks about the idea of staying focused. My daughter sent me something from the internet, and it was a kind of a short story. And it went something like this. You know, first let me introduce it a bit and say this. The question is, why do we need this lesson? I mean, what is the interest, and why do we need a lesson on staying focused? You know, when you start thinking about staying focused as a Christian, it is a very, very important point. There are a lot of distractions in this world. There are many things. For example, you may have heard someone say when you come to a gospel meeting and the preacher says, well, I know there are a lot of things that you could be doing tonight, but you've chosen to be here. He's right. And in our country at the present time, those things are immense. I mean, in my day, we had 3 to 4 channels on the television and very few sporting events. Of course, there was no internet. And so there was not the number of things to do that there are at the present. But in today's world, there are a lot of things to do. In fact, nowadays, when I went to school, very few people drove a car to school. There used to be 3 or 4 cars in the parking lot. But in today's world, of course, high schools are crowded places, and the parking lots are crowded places. And as you leave, I know at Cornersville, there's a sign as you pull out that says, avoid distracted driving. And that is something that we talk a great deal about. Because there's so many things that can distract you as you're driving, and you realize and you understand that. Christians need to understand that too. Christians need to understand that there are a lot of things that vie for their attention. And that as we live this life, there are a lot of things that can pull us away. Some of them sinful and some of them not. But there are a lot of things that can pull us away from God simply as we become distracted by them, and we just really don't stay focused on the task that is before us. My daughter sent me this article, and I'm paraphrasing it. I didn't write it down to read it. I've tried to put it in my own words. I want you to think about this lady who one Sunday at church said to the preacher as she was leaving, "I won't be back." I'm not going to attend anymore. And the preacher said to her, well, why? Why is that true? Why is it that you've decided that you're not going to return? There must be some reason if you're saying that I'm not going to come and worship God any longer. And her answer was that she was asked about that, and she said, well, there's just so many things that other people do. In other words, I'm sitting in the pew and people have their telephones out, and you can see they're not reading their Bible. They're texting, and they're looking at their Facebook, and they're sending messages. And she said, you know, when the Lord's Supper's passed, people are paying no attention to what's being done, and they're just ignoring that, and they're looking over at their neighbor, and they're looking at the children, they're smiling at what's going on, and they're not paying any attention to what's going on. And she said, all these people, I know some of them, and I've seen them out doing things that they really shouldn't be doing, and I just really don't appreciate that, and so I'm not going to come back anymore. And the preacher said, well, he said, I want to give you something to do, if you don't mind. The lady said, all right, what is it that you want me to do? And he said, well, he had filled a glass of water, and it was almost completely full, lacking just a little bit, just barely down from the rim. And he handed it to her and said, I want you to walk around the building once. Just walk around completely and enter the building and hand me the glass of water without spilling any. And she thought that was a little bit strange, but she thought, oh, okay, we can go along with that. And so she takes the glass of water and she goes out the door, and she's very intently watching what she's doing, and she walks completely around the building, and she re-enters the building, and she comes to the preacher, and she hands him the glass back, and she said, I haven't spilled a drop. Everything that was in the glass when I left was in the glass when I returned. And so the preacher says to her, why? Ask her the question, why? How is that true? Why is it that you were able to walk around the building and not spill a drop of water out of this glass? And she said, because I focused on it. I paid really close attention to it. I walked around the building, and every time I took a misstep and it kind of shook the water a little, I'd kind of resituate myself and stabilize my steps and walk a little slower. And I really paid attention, and so everything worked out well, and I came back, and I've not spilled a drop. I would ask you the question, what do you think the preacher said? He said, no, here's the truth. You focused on that. And he said, if you in your service to God would focus on yourself rather than focusing on what other people might or might not be doing, that you'll have a closer relationship with God. And you won't, he said, you think about this. You're saying, I'm going to walk out of the services and I'm not going to worship anymore because what other people do. But it's your relationship with God you're trying to establish. Because he said, you don't control all the other people. You don't have anything to do with what they might do or might not do. You might encourage them. You might rebuke them. You might teach them. You might try to help them. But in the final analysis, you can't control what they're doing. But you can control what you're doing. You know, Jesus, when you think about this message, Jesus said, follow me. But think about this. Your relationship with God should never be based on what other people do. Now, if we went back to the Old Testament, let's just think a moment about that. If you think back to old Elijah, there in 1 Kings 18 and 19, and his situation there at Mount Carmel, and then he comes down off of it, and he comes down, and King is still trying to kill him. There's Jezebel, and she's trying to take his life, and Ahab is supporting her in it because he's misled by her. And all of these things go on, and Elijah goes out, sits down under a tree, and says, Lord, let me die. Why? Because I'm the only one in all of Israel that's serving you faithfully. Of course, he wasn't correct in that. But if he was, let's suppose for a moment that he was. Let me ask you something a moment, and you think about it. Would you rather be Elijah if he was the only one serving God faithfully? Or would you rather be one of the other 1.5 million of the people of Israel? Which would you rather be? Would you be one of the 1.5 million of Israel that are living despicably and involved in idolatry, and idolatry that was terribly immoral just by the very nature of it? Would you rather be in that group, or would you rather be Elijah and have a close relationship with God? And that's really the thing that needs to be paid attention to. Elijah kind of lost focus. Elijah kind of began to think about what Jezebel and Ahab were doing and all the people of Israel were doing, and he really didn't pay much attention to what he was doing. I mean, he's sitting down under a tree and saying to God, it's just better off that I die. Do you think it was really better off that he died? Did he ever stop to think that should he have been removed from the scene, if he were the only one serving God, who would have been left to cry out for the voice of God? Sometimes it's very important that we learn that we have to stay focused. It's something that focuses, and there's really no substitute for it. And in sports, you hear coaches constantly hounding their players about focus, losing your focus. And they're right. It's something that does cause a lot of problems. I don't know why that one's jumping all the way, but maybe we can get it back off of there and start just one at a time. You know, when you think about this, and you look at all these passages, and as they relate to the problem, I'm not quite used to this setup. I'm used to something a little simpler, so it's a little difficult for me to transition to it. But maybe we'll get there. When you look at passages that relate to this problem, what we're saying here is, what kinds of things cause us to lose our focus and to begin to be too concerned with other people and what's taking place in their life? Now, I'm not suggesting that you not strive to be helpful, that in encouraging people, in rebuking people, in correcting people. That's not my point. My point is that you really have one thing that has to be done first, that has to be attended to first. Before you're going to be useful in that area, you're going to have to be a person who's focused on your own relationship with God and develop that relationship with God. So what are some of those things that create the problem? Well, there's some very familiar passages. In Matthew chapter 7, I'm not certain. I've debated many years about the idea of what is the most misquoted, twisted, and perverted passage in the New Testament. And I know that would be a matter of opinion and a matter of judgment. But whether this is the most twisted and perverted and misunderstood passage in the New Testament or not, it would have to be in the top 10. Because what did he say? He said, judge not that you be not judged. We had another lesson recently when we talked about people with selective hearing what they want to hear. There are a lot of people in this world that read this particular passage and they read what they want to hear. They read that verse because that's what they want to hear. And they say to you, you can't ever issue any kind of a statement about the actions of other people, because if you do that, that's judging, and judging is just the greatest of all sins according to men in the present age. It's amazing that people who make that statement have never actually taken the time to read the next 4 verses. Because then he says, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. Now this relates to this subject of focus, by the way, and focusing on yourself. Pay attention to that. He says, when you start judging, you need to realize the first person that has to be judged by that standard is who? You. That's where you have to focus. You have to focus on yourself first. How do I know that's what it means? Because that's what Jesus said. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Oh, how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye. And here's what he said. Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye. That's where your focus comes in. Focusing on yourself. You've got to get yourself in a position of being able to accomplish the objectives of God in saving other souls, because you've already given attention to saving your own. Remember, save yourselves and them that hear you. There's two parts to that equation. And so he said, then thou shalt see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Focus. But people become distracted. They can't see the mote in their own eye. You've all seen the cartoon of the guy that's trying to pick this little splinter out of a person's eye and got a big stick sticking out of his own eye. He can't see what's in his own because he's not focused on himself. He's only focusing on others. In Matthew 23, Jesus said, in fact, that the Pharisees' problem was focus. They focused on the wrong thing. They didn't focus on themselves. He said, the things they say, they do not. Then we think about this. You know, sometimes there's another problem. One of the things that's caused us to be more kind of lose our focus is some people just really get intent on condemning other people. It kind of gives them a high, I guess. Really and truly, if you see someone involved in sin, what's your reaction to that and what's your feeling? And think about how you act toward them. I heard someone say one time about a certain preacher they were talking about, said, well, he acts like they're going to hell and we're proud of it. And sometimes we can come on like that if we're not very careful. We have to understand, you know, we shouldn't have any glee in talking about how horrible people are. Now, they may be horrible, but it shouldn't bring us glee. What should it cause us? You know, when I was younger, in my preaching, used to be quite different, and I really would almost just get belligerent sometimes, and as I've gotten older, I realized that, you know, my point is not to go away and say, boy, wasn't he hard on them? Didn't he just stomp them in the ground and grind them under his heel? Is that really what you want to hear? When Jesus looked at people, in fact, when he came to Jerusalem, was about to crucify him, and as he looked at it, what did he do? Do you remember? He wept. He came and looked at it and he said, this is horrible. This is a mess. Now you think of the contrast of that with old Jonah, who goes to Nineveh, and God says, I'm going to forgive them, and he just has a fit because he wants them destroyed. So which attitude do we have? If we're focused on our relationship with God, and our relationship with God says that if be ye holy as I am holy, what's one of the things required? Think about the prayer that says, when Jesus gave the model prayer, that you forgive those that forgive you if you expect to be forgiven. And remember that Jesus gave the disciples the answer when they said, how many times do you forgive someone? Is there a number? Or are you interested in the outcome? So what if he sins against you 700 times a day? If at the end of the day he has a right relationship with God, isn't that what you want to accomplish? We become distracted because we really kind of lose sight of the fact of what's going on here. When you read Galatians 6:1, it says, if a man be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, just destroy him. Tell everybody you can about how horrible he is, that he's really not worth much, and you don't care what happens to him, and the world would be better off without him. That's not what it says. What it says is, you which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Notice again the idea of focus. Consider yourself. First point. And he says, bear you one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. But people get distracted because we get caught up, almost like a football game, when you start beating somebody and the guy's beating you by 70 and he's trying to beat you by 102. I mean, that's kind of the attitude sometimes we have as a Christian. Our focus needs to be on the fact that, hey, this is about a relationship with God. And I can't have a relationship with God if I don't have the proper and acceptable view toward those who are lost. And what is that? You want them to be saved. Remember what Paul's statement was? My heart's desire for Israel is they might be saved. Remember what he said? He said, I wish that I myself might be lost, that they could be saved. Think of the difference in that. Focus on our relationship with God will keep us away from thoughts of that kind. But then I want to go back to the Old Testament a moment and look at something. You know, it's easier and it's a lot more comfortable to talk about the sins of others than to look at ourselves. In the book of 2 Samuel, and everybody knows this story, it's not a new one. David, of course, had committed the sin with Bathsheba, and this is quite a bit later, and I suppose he thought that the whole thing had blown over, and there are no, maybe he hadn't thought about it in several years, I don't know, in several months, whatever length of time, been at least years had transpired. And I don't know, but maybe he hadn't thought about it. And all of a sudden, the prophet Nathan comes in and tells him for lack of a better word, the parable, the narrative, a story, about a poor guy that lives out here and he just doesn't have much, and he has a little ewe lamb that sleeps with him every night, and he's just a pet. And his neighbor, who's extremely wealthy, comes over and takes his pet and kills it and serves it to his guest. And Nathan was outraged. And he didn't have any problem with that. And it probably felt pretty good to say, well, I'll tell you what, the man that has done that is going to die. His anger was kindled. And he said, as the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this shall die. And not only that, he's going to restore his heirs, I guess, are going to restore fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Now, that's real comfortable. No problem. No problem. But then when Nathan turns and says to him, thou art the man, that was not very comfortable. It's pretty comfortable to just kind of browbeat what other people have done. Oh, it's awful. But when we focus on ourselves, sometimes we may see some similarities. And we may see some things there that need to be worked on. Particularly, I think sometimes parents need to realize that they tell their children things, and then their children see exactly the opposite in them, and that's a problem. But you see, we're pretty comfortable saying, boy, those kids of modern age, they're just awful. But then we may act the same way, and it's a problem. And here's David, and he's actually stolen another man's wife and had him murdered. You think that's worse than taking a sheep and serving it to a guest? Certainly. But David couldn't see that. But how does that come about? That comes about because we're not focused on our relationship with God. We're really not focused on what's going on. You know, I'm going to ask you a question you think about in a moment. If David had truly been focused on his relationship with God, well, let's just suppose that in a moment of weakness he commits the sin of adultery. Bathsheba's expecting a child. He gets a little caught up and he has someone murdered. At some point along the line, if you are focused on your relationship with God, don't you think all of a sudden you say, whew, this is bad. Why did I do that? I mean, and go and say, just lay himself at the mercy of the people and tell the priest to offer sacrifice for me. Look at all the things I've done that are horrible. If you're really focused on your relationship with God, you think you can just ignore all that? You think you can just pay no attention to it? And you can just act as if it doesn't happen? And yet if someone else does something, you can see it and you're comfortable with that. But you're not comfortable dealing with the sins that might be in your own life. I think sometimes focus is something that people really, we need to be intent on. It's almost like every morning when you wake up, maybe the first thing you need to talk about with God is your relationship with Him, and make sure that my actions this day actually reflect a relationship with you. And that people don't have to ask me, are you a Christian? They can see that. Maybe that's what our attitude should be. But, you know, it's kind of not unusual. People kind of get out of focus. And you think about this too. It's a lot easier to condemn other people than to correct yourself. And in the New Testament, you see a little bit of that in 1 Corinthians 11. Paul's talking about the Lord's Supper. Now, he'd already said that when you come together, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. And, of course, he told the problem that was existent there. And all of that indicated something. You know what it indicated? It indicated the lack of focus. What are you here for? To eat a meal? To satisfy your physical hunger? To satisfy your physical thirst? Is that what you're doing? Is that what it's about? If you're focused on your relationship with God, you understand it's nothing to do with that. It hadn't been too long ago, I had a person that said to me at a church service, and I didn't really know how to respond to it. When he said it, it kind of took me aback because I never had it said to him before. He said, you know, we need to have a bigger piece of bread to eat because this I just don't really even know why I even bother. And I thought, hold on now. I mean, it's not how big a piece of bread we have. What is it about? It's about your relationship with God. I mean, you think about what he said in this passage. What he says in this passage is, he said, you know, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death till he come again. And he goes on there to talk, and he says, you know, whosoever shall eat of this bread and drink of this cup unworthily. Now, this is talking about focus. That's exactly what it means. If you eat of this bread and you're not focused on what you're doing and drink of that cup and you're not focused on what you're doing, then you're missing the point. And then he said this, let a man examine himself and let him eat of that bread and drink of that cup. Many years ago, I remember preaching a sermon that said that as far as I am aware, there is only, this is an individual action collectively participated in. So all of us do it, but I don't have any control over you. None. And you don't have any control over me. This is a place you really have to focus within. And the passage goes on to say, he that eateth and drinketh unworthily eateth and drinketh damnation to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. Not discerning. That again has to do with the word to focus. For this cause, many are weak and sickly among you, and many sleep. For when we are judged, we are chastened of the Lord, that we should not be condemned with the world. Added a verse to that. But it's important to notice this idea. You know, you think of the lady in the story. The Lord's Supper's passed, and she's looking, and she's mad because somebody... But you know, you stop and think sometimes, you also have to be careful to kind of realize there's a saying that all that glitters is not gold. The opposite is also true. Every time you see something that you imagine to be horrible, it may not be. If you see a young mother that's kind of picking at a kid, well, maybe they've lost their focus, but it may be they're trying to make sure that everyone else can be focused so the baby can be quiet enough for it to happen. So you have to be a little bit careful in some things. And how do you accomplish that? If you're sitting there thinking about yourself and your relationship with God, do you think you'll notice what anybody else in the building is doing when you're taking the Lord's Supper? You ever think of that? That focus. If we lose it, we can have a serious problem. And we can become so concerned sometimes with things that are irrelevant, things that really have nothing to do with anything. And that happens too. Christians get concerned about things that have nothing to do with their spiritual relationship at all. Nothing to do with them at all. Because they just get caught up in something. You know, when David killed Goliath and they were returning, and the women were singing the song and saying, Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his tens of thousands. Saul got mad. Let me ask you a question. Do you ever hear when you were a child, your parents ever tell you, that's why I really get a little irritated at people today talking about their space and their space being violated and all this garbage, and people need to realize that there's an old saying about sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me. I remember umpiring baseball one time and I walked off the field and some guy said to me, that's the worst job I've ever seen. And I said, thank you, I really appreciate it. And I just walked off because what else? I mean, what difference does it make? I mean, you get down to it, what difference does it make? I mean, these people are singing about David. Saul is the king. And ask yourself the question, why did David do that in the first place? Because Saul was setting up in his tent, gave his armor to David, said, go kill the giant, and he didn't go. And then he complained. It's kind of like a lot of Christians, a lot of members of the church. They complain about what people are doing, and the problem is they're not doing anything themselves because they've lost their focus. If Saul would have done his duty, lived up to his responsibility, that song would have never been sang. And even if it was sang, what difference did it make? He got really concerned about that. In fact, from that day forward, Saul eyed David and intended to kill him. Why? Did it really matter? David was at that time approximately a 17-year-old kid. I'm sure he was a real threat to Saul from a standpoint of human beings looking at it. We get distracted by just things that are insignificant. How many times, I was riding home yesterday and up there the first time, but yesterday's fresher. And the twins are sitting there beside me. They're right beside each other. They're 3 years old. And Izzy says, Jasper touched me and he intended to. He did it on purpose. He touched you. I mean, that's a big issue here. But adults are like that. We lose our focus, and sometimes you see church fights over things that are so ridiculous, it's just crazy. Why? I once went to a congregation, and they were having a serious problem. I even had people come to the meeting and come to me before the meeting started, saying, need to preach on love this week. They need it. Well, I found out after a while what really had happened. They were rebuilding the building. And they, like here, there was usually the choice between blue and green. That's usually it. Maybe some beige thrown in there, but it's usually blue and green. And so I don't remember which they picked, but whichever they picked, the guy that ordered something else. And that's what the whole thing was about. That the wrong color covers got on the seats, and I don't really know exactly why. But you stop and think about it. You think that was a big enough issue to destroy the peace and harmony of the congregation? Now, does that show that, hey, we're focused? What are we here for? If I came in here tonight, and I hadn't been here, and I can't remember when I came to your singing, but it's been a while back, if someone would have asked me, what color are the seats in the building? You know what I'd have said? I don't know. I don't have a clue. What difference does it make? But if you ask me, do they use the piano? I can tell you right quick, no, they don't use one. That does make a difference. The color of the pews doesn't. Staying focused on our relationship with God. Have a few more points I want to make and then we'll quit. We can become so concerned with things that are irrelevant that we don't attend to the things that we can correct, as we said. And that's exactly what happened there with King Saul. I said so much about and forgot to put on the screen. But then let's think about things that the lack of focus have caused. And let's think about those a moment. These are pretty simple. Everybody knows the story. I mean, you teach it to your children in the Bible class. Here's Peter walking on the water. Oh, that's magnificent. Peter's able to walk on the water. Why was he able to walk on the water? Because Jesus told him to. You probably taught that in your Bible class to the 3 and 4 year olds many, many times. But there's a valuable lesson here. It began in verse 25. Fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. In other words, it's about dawn, the darkest part of the night. And the disciples, when they saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, it is a spirit. They cried out. Straightway Jesus said, be of good cheer. Peter said, if it's you, Lord, if it's you, if it be thou, bid me come into the water. And he said, come follow me. And so Peter steps out of the ship. He walked on the water to go to Jesus, and everything was fine. You know why? Because he was focused on his relationship with the Lord. If I would have asked Peter, can you walk on water? You know what the answer would have been? No. So why would he step out of the boat and walk on the water? And how was that possible? It had nothing to do with Peter, and he knew it. And so when he began to doubt, who was he doubting? What was he forgetting? Here's Peter. He's seen the water turn to wine. He's seen the people healed. He's seen people raised from the dead. He's seen all kinds of things. And all of a sudden, he doesn't believe that the man who did that can cause you to walk on water. Doesn't believe that. You say, how do I know he didn't believe it? because that's what Jesus said. Because when he began to sink, Jesus stretched forth his hand, caught him, and said, O thou of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? Now you think about that, and you realize how important it is to stay focused. If somebody asks me a question, I'm kind of like Dave Ramsey. Dave Ramsey always, when people ask him the question, how you doing, he always says the same thing, I guess, on every radio show he ever had, better than I deserve. If somebody asks you as a Christian, how are you? That really is the answer. Because the wages of sin is death. How many sins are worthy of death? One. How many have you committed? I don't know. I don't know how many I've committed. You think I could number them? You stop and you think about it. The only reason I'm saved is because of my relationship with God. And Peter should have known. The reason I can walk on this water is my relationship. But when I lose focus with that and I begin to look at the water rather than my relationship, then I've got a problem. And a lot of people say, I just can't do it. You think that's an acceptable answer? This is just overpowering? Marty Robbins sang a song about this time, Lord, you gave me a mountain too high, I can't climb it. Do you think the Lord gives you a mountain too high? Did he not say that with every temptation he provides a way of escape? Did Paul not say, I can do all things through Christ which strengthens me? Don't blame God. Blame's on you. Your problem is that you're just not focused. And you don't realize where your strength and where your power comes from. And you know, sometimes we do become very concerned with other people. And we think about other people. We even have a song in our book, I suppose it's in this one, Tempted and Tried, We're All Made to Wonder. What do we wonder about? Why are these people who are so wicked and nasty in their behavior and their actions and their lives, why are they so wealthy? And why they don't have cancer? And why is it they don't have all the things that we've had, as we might look in our minds? It's kind of typical. You remember that Jesus here is dealing with Peter. And remember, this is, would be, 80 hours at the most after Peter's denied the Lord 3 times? And so Jesus is kind of making a point. Asked Jesus the question there in this particular passage, do you love me more than these? There's been a lot of discussion about that, which we won't even speak of. And Peter said, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus could have said, yeah, I knew you loved me when you said, I don't even know the man, began to curse and swear and say, I don't know him. That really showed that you love me. Peter kind of forgot that. But then he asked him the question again. And Peter, he's getting grieved. He's getting a little bit agitated. You know, I've already told you. And he said, lovest thou me? And he did it the 3rd time. And finally Peter just said, Lord, thou knowest all these things. Thou knowest that I love thee. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. He said, verily, verily, I say unto you. And here's what he said to Peter. When thou wast young, you went where you wanted to. You walked whether you wanted to go. But when you're old, you'll stretch forth thy hands, and another shall gird thee and carry thee whither thou wouldest not. Speaking, I suspect, of imprisonment. Well, Peter kind of gave that a little thought. And, of course, as Jesus was describing his imprisonment and death, he says to him, follow me, and Peter couldn't help it. He couldn't help it. I mean, Jesus just said, remember in the beginning of our lesson we talked about follow me? Jesus just said, follow me. And he stopped. You can almost see him. Well, Jesus, what about this man? Talking about John. What about this man? Where was his focus? Do you think it was where Jesus was trying to center it? Jesus was trying to center it on, hey, he said, you know, you denied me 3 times. We're trying to get this thing back in a proper perspective. But when you look at it in this situation, Peter turns and said, what about him? What shall this man do? And the answer that Jesus gave, I thought, one of the greatest answers of all time. If I tarry till he come, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is that to thee? Follow thou me. What difference does it make? Probably every one of you said that to your children at some point in time, if you got more than one. And they said, well, Daddy, what about them? What if I can give them whatever I want to give them? Got nothing to do with it. Here's what I've given you to do. I can do whatever I wish over there. Here's what I've given you to do. That's where your focus should be. Last point I want to make is this. You know, we have to learn that to be saved eternally is going to require focus on our part. We've got to be focused. We can't be distracted. We can't be distracted by sinful things. We can't be distracted by things that are just everyday affairs that kind of jump up at us. We just can't. When Paul, in Philippians 3, and I'm going to read all this pretty quickly because it's a long reading. Paul is describing his relationship with Christ, and he's talking about where he came from, what he had to give up. And it's interesting to notice at the end, the last words that he tells us in that last statement. He says, what things were gained to me, those I counted loss for Christ. Why? Because I'm focused. I know what I'm trying to accomplish. Yea, doubtless, and I count all things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Jesus Christ my Lord, for whom I've suffered the loss of all things. And I tell you what, I'm not regretting that. I do count them but dung that I may win Christ. Why? Because I'm focused. I don't whine about what it could have been, what I might have done. I've even heard Christians say, oh boy, I've tried to be a Christian all these years and think of all the fun I missed. Boy, what a silly statement. And he said, I did it to be found in him, not having mine own righteousness, which is of the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is of God by faith, that I might know him, and the power of his resurrection, the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death, if by any means I might attain to the resurrection of the dead, not as though I'd already attained, either were already perfect, but I follow after, if that I may apprehend that for which I am apprehended of Christ Jesus. What's in the Old Testament? What is the greatest illustration of a loss of focus? In my opinion, it would be as Lot and his wife and two daughters are leaving Sodom, and the Lord had said, don't look back. Why you don't look back? Because when you do, you lose focus. What do you need to be looking at? If you're driving down the road, where do you need to be looking? Ahead, not behind. And if you lose your focus, what can happen, and quite often does? That's the problem with distracted driving. But if you read this, and he said this, verse 13, Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind. Let me ask you something. I'll just tell you an illustration. Monday morning before I left on my trip, had an interesting occurrence. Dogs were digging at the fence. Thought this was going to get out. Went and got me a piece of OSB, slew it over the fence, got me a dolly so I could roll it over there, flopped it down on the hole I thought. Stepped in a hole about this big and fell, and I thought I wasn't going to be able to take the trip because I was in a mess and laying in the yard calling my daughter. But you know, tonight, as I sit here, we were able to drive to Wisconsin. My brother's 86, and as we left each other, we know it's probably the last time we'll ever see each other. And you think about that, and does it really matter I fell in a hole on Monday? Does it really matter I've got an arm that's a little stiff and a little sore and a rib that can't hardly breathe sometimes? Is that important? Does that matter? I mean, Paul said, you don't look behind. Those things in the past, I mean, Paul killed a lot of Christians. I still think about the fact of how many sleepless nights he might have missed over thinking about Stephen being stoned to death and him holding the coats. I think about that. But can he think about that and that be his focus? No, that can't be his focus. That's behind. What's in front? And he can't be distracted. Because if he is, then he can miss. Because what did he say? Forget those things which are behind, reaching forth those things which are before, I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. When I was a kid, people were still farming with mules to some degree. I actually plowed a few fields with mules myself. And my uncle would always say to me if I was laying off rows is this: where you look when you lay a row off? You look at the row? You look down at the row and pay attention to it so much? Nah, you pick out a point on the other side of the field and you say, I'm looking at that fence post and I'm going to walk straight toward it. If you get to looking around you on this earth, it's kind of like a little yappy dog nipping at your heels. He's probably not going to hurt you, but if you get so distracted by it, you can fall. As Mr. Dean used to say, he might cause you to hurt yourself. There are a lot of things that can distract us. We need to be focused. Are you value your relationship with God? You know, you have to be focused, and you can't lose it. One of the problems you have with Calvinism, it believes in once saved, always saved. If you believe that, you're in trouble because it's not true. It's like a fellow told me many times years ago. He said, the only trouble with that, it just ain't so. Great idea, just ain't so. Are you focused? I know you need to obey the gospel, and I would hope that if you're here this evening, you've never been baptized into Christ, that you in fact would do that. Jesus said, he that believeth baptized shall be saved, he that believeth not shall be condemned. I don't even know how you comment on that other than to say on, brother. But if you've done that, it's kind of like graduating from high school. Do you really think graduation from high school is an end? Is that an ending? Everybody knows that's not true. It's a beginning. When you're baptized into Christ, what is it? It's the beginning. From that point, how many things vie for your attention? How many things are trying to pull you away from God? Sinful temptations and things that may not be wrong within and of themselves. But how many things? Where's your focus need to be? You want to go to heaven when you die? I preached a lesson last Sunday, debated on using it tonight, and it talked about why am I religious and why do I attend church? People need to think about those questions because they're important. Why? If your reason is not, I want to be saved eternally and please God, then I just say to you, it's not much point to it, and you might as well forget it. Because that's the point. I'm trying to live so as to be saved eternally, to be with God in eternity. And I'm trying to keep my focus on my relationship with Jesus Christ. And I hope that when I see sin in other people, that I don't ignore it, that I try to help them to overcome it. But I hope that I don't become so consumed with it that if I can't overcome that, if my brother says, no, I'm going to walk and do what I please, that it's not going to affect me, that I can still go on. And I'm not going to be worried about the Lord. What is this man doing? I need to worry about this man's doing. And you need to think about it. If you need to respond to the invitation, we extend it to you. Together we stand as we sing.